The air in the Aurora Lodge at Thule was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 stories. It smelled of damp wool, wood smoke from the great stone hearth, and the faint, acrid tang of jet fuel that clung to everything and everyone this far north of the world. Outside, the Greenland ice sheet was a howling white emptiness, a place that scoured the weakness from a man or buried him beneath it. Inside, it was a pocket of weary warmth. Neon signs for forgotten beers buzzed with an insectal hum above the bar. The scarred wooden tables bore the carved initials of men long since rotated home or long since gone. An old man sat alone in a deep leather armchair near the fire. He was a study in stillness. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested on the worn arms of the chair. They did not tremble. They were as steady as the granite of the fireplace. His face was a roadmap of years, canyons carved around his eyes and mouth, his skin weathered like old parchment. He wore a simple, faded flannel shirt and a dark, insulated jacket that had seen better decades. Pinned to the jacket's collar was a small, unassuming silver device. It was tarnished with age, its details obscured unless you looked closely. He held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee, its steam rising to wreathe his face before vanishing. He watched the flames dance and writhe, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue, like a winter sky after a storm. He did not seem to be a part of the room's low thrum. He was an island in its current, a silent anchor in a sea of restless youth. The door swung open with a blast of Arctic air that made the fire gutter and leap. A group of young officers strode in, bringing the cold with them. They were loud, their laughter sharp and brittle in the warm space. They stomped snow from their boots, their faces flushed with adrenaline and the sting of the wind. At their center was Captain Reed Vance. Vance was the very picture of the modern warrior. He was tall, with the lean, predatory build of a runner. His flight suit was crisp, adorned with patches that spoke of speed and lethality. His hair was a perfect military crop, his jaw sharp, his eyes alight with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world was built for him to conquer. He was a fighter pilot. He flew machines that tore the sky apart, and he carried that violence in his posture. His squadron mates orbited him, their energy feeding his own. They were young, fit, and brimming with the cocksure confidence that came from mastering billion-dollar technology. Vance threw his gloves onto a table, his voice cutting through the lodge's murmur. An absolute joke. You called it a joint exercise? The ground pounders couldn't hit the broadside of a glacier from 500 yards. One of his lieutenants chuckled. Wind's tricky today, Skip. Gusting to 40-inch. Wind is always tricky, Vance shot back, his tone laced with condescending authority. That's the point. You adapt or you fail. They failed. Spectacularly. He was talking about the sniper observer teams from the visiting Army unit. They had been running cold weather drills on a range carved out of the ice, and the blizzard conditions had made a mockery of their efforts. Vance saw the world in simple terms. Winners and losers. Those who could, and those who could not. He flew faster than sound. They crawled on their bellies in the snow. To him, the hierarchy was obvious. His gaze swept the room, a king surveying his court, and it landed on the old man by the fire. Vance's lip curled into a smirk. He nudged one of his companions. Look at that. Think Grandpa got lost on his way to the bingo hall. The laughter was muted, a little uncomfortable. The other pilots had the decency to at least feign respect for their elders. Vance had no such filter. The old man did not move. He did not look up from the fire. His hand remained perfectly steady around his mug. It was as if Vance's words were just more noise in a room already full of it, as meaningless as the crackle of the logs. This, more than any angry retort could have, pricked Captain Vance's ego. He was a captain, an F-22 pilot. When he spoke, people listened. Junior officers jumped. Enlisted men snapped to attention. Old men in worn-out jackets were supposed to at least have the courtesy to be intimidated. The quiet indifference was a challenge, a personal affront. Vance's internal monologue began to simmer. Who the hell does this relic think he is? This is a military installation. My installation. He's probably some retired desk jockey who thinks his 20 years pushing paper gives him the right to ignore a real officer. He pushed away from his table, his squadron mates watching with a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. He swaggered over to the fireplace, positioning himself between the old man and the flames, casting a long, sharp shadow. "Hey, old-timer, I'm talking to you." Vance's voice was louder now, designed to draw attention, to make this a public lesson. The old man slowly, deliberately, lifted his gaze from the fire. He blinked once, his pale blue eyes meeting Vance's. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was just a deep, profound weariness. They were eyes that had seen too many sunrises, too many winters. He said nothing. "This is a recreation facility for active duty personnel," Vance continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Lost your way from the civilian terminal." The old man took a slow sip of his coffee. The silence stretched, growing heavy and thick. The low chatter in the lodge had completely died. Every eye was now on the confrontation by the hearth. From behind the bar, a young man was wiping down the counter. Airman First Class Croft. He was 19, barely 6 months at his first duty station, and he hated the soul-crushing cold of Thule. He polished glasses and served drinks and counted the days until he could transfer somewhere with trees. He saw what was happening. He saw the arrogant captain, a pilot known for his ego, bearing down on a quiet old man who just wanted to drink his coffee in peace. It was a scene as old as time, the strong preying on the seemingly weak. Croft's father had been a Marine. He taught his son 2 things: do your job without complaint and never, ever stand by while a bully works. He watched Vance's posture, the way he puffed out his chest. He watched the old man's unnerving calm. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. "I asked you a question," Vance pressed, his frustration mounting. The old man's silence was a mirror, and Vance did not like the reflection. It made him feel small, foolish. "I heard you," the old man finally said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. It was a voice that had not been used much that day. The simple, factual statement infuriated Vance. "You heard me? Is that all you have to say? Show me some respect. I'm a captain in the United States Air Force." "I'm aware," the old man said, his eyes flicking down to the silver captain's bars on Vance's collar, then back up to his face. The utter lack of deference was galling. Vance felt his face flush. He was losing control of the situation. He needed to reassert his authority to win. "Then you're aware that I have the authority to ask who you are and what your business is here. Let me see your identification. Your credentials." It was an unwarranted demand, an abuse of his station. This was a recreational lodge, not a secure area. But Vance was beyond procedure. This was about dominance. The old man's gaze drifted back to the fire. "That won't be necessary." "Is that so?" Vance sneered, his voice rising. "I think it is. Are you refusing an order?" The old man sighed, a soft exhalation of breath. It was the sigh of a man burdened not by the captain's foolishness, but by the sheer, repetitive nature of human folly. He had seen this type of man before, in different uniforms, in different languages, across half a century. The face was new, but the arrogance was ancient. Vance noticed the pin on the old man's collar for the first time. He leaned in, squinting. It was a small winged device, tarnished and worn smooth. "What's this?" "Strategic Air Command." Vance scoffed. "A Cold War relic. What were you, a supply clerk? A cook? Bet you were real dangerous behind a typewriter." He poked a finger at the pin, his nails scraping against the aged metal. "Every airman has a story, Captain," the old man said, his voice still unervingly calm. "Even the ones who don't fly." "Oh, I'm sure," Vance mocked. "Tell me, what was your call sign? Pops? Granddad? Did they let you have a call sign back when you were flying wooden planes?" The word hung in the air. Call sign. And the other word. Winter. The sight of the snow, a furious white vortex swirling outside the lodge window, and the arrogant challenge from the young pilot coalesced. They became a key, turning a lock deep within the old man's mind. The lodge dissolved. The warmth of the fire vanished, replaced by a cold that was not just in the air, but in his bones, in his very soul. He was 24 years old again. The snow was not a picturesque flurry outside a window. It was a living entity, a predator. It fell in a blinding, horizontal sheet, driven by a wind that sounded like a dying animal. The temperature was 50 below zero before the wind chill. He lay in a snow cave he had dug with his bare hands and a small entrenching tool, a narrow slit offering the only view of the world. He had been there for 3 days. His world had shrunk to the crosshairs of his scope. Through it, he saw a small, heavily guarded radar installation perched on a desolate mountain ridge somewhere north of the Ural Mountains. It was a ghost facility, not on any map. His mission was simple and impossible. A high-ranking Soviet general, a hardliner named Volkov, was secretly visiting the site. Volkov was the architect of a new first strike missile protocol. Taking him out would destabilize the hardliner faction in the Kremlin and buy Washington precious time. The shot was over 1,300 meters. In a blizzard, he hadn't eaten a warm meal in a week. His body was consuming itself to stay alive. But his hands were steady. His breathing was a slow, controlled rhythm, each exhale a plume of white that he had to carefully divert to avoid giving away his position. His spotter, a young Marine named Miller, had succumbed to the cold 2 days prior. His last words had been a feverish whisper about the sun. There was no sun here. There was only the white dark. Now he was alone. Command had told him to abort. No one could make that shot. The wind was too unpredictable, the visibility near zero. The mission was a failure. He had disobeyed. He knew something Command, with all their satellites and weather balloons, did not. He had been watching the snow for 72 hours. He had become part of it. He could feel its patterns, the way the wind held its breath for a heartbeat between gusts. A 2-second window. That was all he would get. Through the swirling snow, he saw a flicker of movement. A group of figures moving from the command bunker to a waiting armored vehicle. One of them was taller, wearing the distinctive greatcoat and hat of a general. Volkov. He laid his cheek against the frozen stock of his rifle. The metal was so cold it felt hot, searing his skin. He didn't notice. His finger rested on the trigger. He was not Elias Vance then. He was an instrument, a tool of his nation's will. He had a name. They called him over the crackling radio when missions like this came up. A name born of the ice and the silence. The wind howled a furious, deafening scream. Then for a single, perfect instant, it stopped. The world held its breath. The snow parted like a curtain. His world was the crosshairs, the general's chest, the space between heartbeats. He exhaled, and he squeezed. The recoil was a familiar punch to his shoulder. The crack of the rifle was swallowed by the returning wind. He saw the general stumble, a dark flower blooming on the gray of his greatcoat. He fell into the snow and did not move again. The mission was complete. They called him the Winter Soldier. The memory faded, leaving an echo of impossible cold. The old man was back in the lodge, the warmth of the fire on his face. Captain Vance was still standing over him, his face a mask of smug impatience. Airman Croft saw the change in the old man's eyes. The weariness was gone, replaced by something ancient and hard, like glacial ice. It was an unnerving, predatory stillness. It was the look of a man who was not in a lodge, but on a hunt. That was it. Croft couldn't watch anymore. He moved quickly, slipping through the service door into the back corridor. He ignored the kitchen phone and went straight to the secure line in the manager's office. He knew the protocol. He dialed the command post. Command post, Airman Riley speaking. "This is Airman Croft at the Aurora Lodge," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need to speak to the battle commander's aide. It's an urgent matter." "What's the nature of the issue, Airman?" There's an officer here, a captain, who is harassing a guest, an elderly gentleman. Sir, I think this guest might be someone important. He's wearing an old SAC pin, but it's the way he's carrying himself. The captain is out of line, way out of line." There was a pause on the other end. "Stand by, Croft." Back in the main room, Vance had reached the end of his non-existent patience. "All right, that's it. You're coming with me. We're going to find out exactly who you are." Vance reached down and grabbed the old man's arm, his fingers digging into the thin muscle above the elbow. It was the final overreach, the line that could not be uncrossed. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't resist. He simply looked down at the hand on his arm. and then back up at Captain Vance's face. And in that look, Vance, for the first time, felt a flicker of doubt. A cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He was looking into the eyes of a man who was utterly, completely unafraid. Then the lodge doors crashed open. They didn't swing. They were thrown open with such force that they slammed against the interior walls, the sound like a gunshot. A wave of frigid air and swirling snow blasted into the room. Framed in the doorway were two massive security forces master sergeants in full tactical gear, rifles held at a low ready. Between them stood a man who radiated an authority that made Captain Vance's seem like a child's costume. Colonel David Matthews, the base commander. He was a tall, severe man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the wind. His uniform was immaculate. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept the room in a single, all-encompassing glance. The silence in the lodge was absolute. It was a heavy, crushing thing. The fire crackled, the sound suddenly deafening. Vance froze. His hand was still on the old man's arm. He felt every eye in the room on him, on his hand. He snatched it back as if he'd been burned. A wave of nausea and terror washed over him. What is the base commander doing here? Colonel Matthews's gaze passed over Vance, as if he were a piece of furniture. He ignored him completely. His eyes found the old man in the chair. The colonel's entire demeanor shifted. The hard lines of his face softened. The icy fury in his eyes melted away, replaced by something that looked like awe, reverence. He began to walk forward, his polished boots thudding on the wooden floor. The two master sergeants followed, flanking him, their eyes scanning the room, their presence a promise of overwhelming force. They moved past Captain Vance, who seemed to shrink, to physically diminish as they passed. Colonel Matthews came to a stop directly in front of the old man's chair. He took a sharp breath, his back ramrod straight. He brought his heels together with a sound like a rifle bolt snapping shut. And then, in the dead silent room, he rendered the sharpest, most heartfelt salute of his entire 30-year career. His hand was a blade, quivering with precision and emotion. "Sir," the colonel's voice boomed, clear and ringing with respect. "It is an honor to have you at my base." The old man looked up at the saluting colonel. He gave a slow, tired nod. "At ease, David. You'll scare the children." Colonel Matthews held the salute for a second longer before slowly, crisply, bringing his hand down. He stood at a perfect position of attention. He finally turned his head, his eyes finding the pale, terrified face of Captain Vance. The warmth was gone. His eyes were chips of obsidian. His voice, when he spoke, was a blade of Arctic ice. "Captain Vance." Vance flinched. "Sir," the word was a choked whisper. "I'm going to ask you a question, Captain," the colonel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And you're going to answer it. What, precisely, did you think you were doing when I walked in here?" "Sir," this man, he wouldn't identify himself. "I was concerned about security." The lie was flimsy, pathetic, and it died on his lips under the colonel's crushing gaze. "Security," Matthews repeated, the word an insult. He took a step closer to Vance, his voice dropping even lower, a furious hiss. "You were concerned about security, so you decided to publicly harass and physically assault a guest on my base. Is that the summary of your actions?" "Sir, I did not assault him. I just—" "You put your hands on him," Matthews snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "I saw you. This entire room saw you." He gestured to the crowd of silent, wide-eyed airmen and officers. "You, Captain, are a disgrace, not just to your uniform, but to the very idea of an officer." Matthews turned his back on Vance, a gesture of ultimate contempt, and addressed the room. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice ringing with authority and a strange, profound sadness. "Most of you are too young to know the history that walks among you. You see an old man. You see a relic. Your eyes are not trained to see what is truly there." He gestured to the quiet figure in the chair. "You have the profound and unearned privilege of being in the presence of Chief Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, retired, a man who served this nation for 35 years. A murmur went through the room. Chief Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank, a living legend in its own right. Vance's face went white. He had called a chief old-timer. But his rank, as esteemed as it is the least of his story. Colonel Matthews continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a historian, a storyteller. Some men fly the planes. Some men fix them. And some men are the reason the pilots get to come home at all. He looked at the group of pilots Vance had been holding court with. Captain Vance was just mocking our Army brethren for their difficulty on the sniper range today, complaining that in a blizzard they couldn't hit a target at 500 yards. Matthews paused, letting the weight of his words settle. In the winter of 1978, a single operator was inserted deep into hostile territory in the Ural Mountains. His mission was to eliminate a target that, if left unchecked, would have pushed the Cold War into a hot one. The target was over 1,300 meters away. The temperature was 50 below zero, and he was in the middle of a blizzard so severe that all aerial reconnaissance was blind. The colonel's eyes were fixed on Elias Thorne, who was now looking back into the fire, as if embarrassed by the attention. For 3 days, he lay in the snow, alone. His support was dead. Command had scrubbed the mission. They told him to come home, said the shot was impossible. The wind, the snow, the distance, it was a mathematical impossibility. The room was so quiet. The only sound was the hiss and pop of the burning logs. This man, Matthews said, his voice thick with emotion as he pointed a trembling finger toward Thorne, did not believe in the impossible. He waited. He became part of the storm. And when the wind gave him a 2-second window, he took a shot that military theorists still study to this day. A shot that saved countless lives and may have saved the world. He let that sink in. They didn't call him Chief Thorne on the radio. They had another name for him. A name whispered in fear by our enemies and in awe by our allies. They called him the Winter Soldier. A collective gasp went through the room. The Winter Soldier. It was a myth. A boogeyman from the Cold War that instructors used to scare new recruits. A ghost story about a single man who could appear anywhere, in any weather, and change the course of history with a single bullet. And he was here, sitting by the fire. The very manual on cold weather marksmanship that those Army snipers were studying today, Colonel Matthews said, his voice now a low growl as he turned his full, unrestrained fury back onto Captain Vance. The one filled with complex formulas for windage and Coriolis effect in Arctic conditions. Chief Thorne wrote the first draft, in a snow cave, with a pencil, after his partner froze to death beside him. The verbal blows landed on Vance like physical punches. His arrogance had shattered, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. He stared at the old man, at Chief Thorne, and saw not a relic, but a monument. A force of nature. You, Captain, Matthews spat, jabbing a finger into Vance's chest. You, who I have personally reprimanded twice for reckless flying in clear weather. You, whose biggest hardship is a delayed shipment of your favorite brand of coffee to the commissary. You dared to lecture this man. You dared to question him. You dared to put your hands on him. Sir, I didn't know, Vance stammered, his voice breaking. You didn't know, the colonel roared, and the entire room flinched. That is the entire point. An officer's duty is to know, to see beyond the surface, to understand that greatness does not always announce itself with trumpets. You saw an old man, and your arrogance saw a target. You have failed in your most basic duty as a leader, as an officer, and as a man. Matthew stepped back, his chest heaving. He regained his composure, his voice turning cold and clinical. Captain Reed Vance, you are hereby relieved of all flight and command duties, effective immediately. You are confined to your quarters under guard until a full investigation is completed. An investigation which I will personally oversee and which I assure you will result in the end of your Air Force career. You will be lucky if you are allowed to resign in disgrace. He turned to one of the hulking master sergeants. Master Sergeant, escort this officer to his quarters. Ensure he speaks to no one inch. Yes, sir, the NCO grunted. He grabbed Vance's arm, his grip like a steel vise, a stark contrast to Vance's earlier, pathetic attempt. As he was marched toward the door, a broken man, Vance looked back one last time at Chief Thorne. His face was a mess of shame, regret, and terror. The chief finally looked away from the fire. He met Vance's gaze, and he gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of forgiveness. It was a nod of understanding, of pity. Then the doors closed, and he was gone. Colonel Matthews let out a long, slow breath. He walked back to the armchair, his posture now that of a subordinate addressing a revered superior. "Chief, on behalf of my entire command, I am so deeply sorry." Elias Thorne looked up, his pale blue eyes clear. He finally spoke, his gravelly voice filling the reverent silence. "He's just a boy, David." The colonel looked confused. "Sir," full of fire and vinegar, the chief continued, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "The service needs that fire. He just needs to learn where to point it. Maybe this will teach him." It was a moment of grace so profound it stunned the entire room. After what he had just endured, the old warrior's first instinct was not vengeance, but teaching. The colonel seemed a loss for words. "Sir, is there anything I can get you? A meal? An escort to your quarters?" Chief Thorne slowly, stiffly, pushed himself up from a chair. He placed his empty mug on the mantelpiece. "No, thank you, Colonel. I think I'll just take a walk. Enjoy the quiet." He turned and walked toward the door. The crowd of airmen, pilots, and officers parted for him like the sea before Moses. They stood in silence, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and profound respect. He didn't look at any of them. He simply walked to the door, pulled his worn jacket tighter, and stepped out into the swirling white chaos. The door swung shut behind him, and he was gone, disappearing into the storm as if he were part of it. An epilogue was written in the days that followed. Captain Reed Vance was formally discharged from the Air Force under a general discharge, his career in aviation over forever. He was last heard of selling insurance in a small town in Ohio, the fire in his eyes replaced by a permanent, haunted shadow. Colonel Matthews made the story of Chief Master Sergeant Elias, the Winter Soldier, Thorne a mandatory part of the indoctrination brief for every single person assigned to Thule Air Base. A framed photo of the chief, taken from his official file, was hung in the Aurora Lodge, right above the armchair by the fire. Underneath it, a simple brass plaque read, "Respect is not demanded. It is earned," and sometimes it sits quietly by the fire. Airman First Class Croft received a personal letter of commendation from the colonel and found his transfer request to a base with actual trees mysteriously fast-tracked. And Elias Thorne? He was never seen at Thule again. He lived his quiet life in a small, snowy cabin in Montana, his days measured by the rising and setting of the sun. He fished in the summer and read by the fire in the winter, a quiet old man in a quiet house. A ghost, a legend. The silence he left behind in that lodge was louder than any jet engine, a profound and lasting testament to the fact that the most dangerous men are often the ones you never see coming.